The November cold settled over the pine woods of Georgia like a blanket, thin and persistent. Frost clung to the barbed wire, glittering in the pale morning sun. It was 1944, the 4th Thursday of November. Inside Camp Gordon, thousands of German prisoners of war stirred from their bunks, breath misting in the air, voices low and rough with sleep. Among them was Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, 32 years old, captured 3 months earlier in Normandy when his panzer division had been obliterated by American air superiority. His uniform, once crisp and decorated, now hung loose on his frame, patched at the elbows, the eagle and swastika carefully removed by American scissors. He sat on his bunk, lacing his boots, listening to the morning sounds of captivity. The clang of metal doors, the shuffle of feet, the distant hum of American trucks rolling past the compound. Across from him, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A younger man named Dieter stretched his arms overhead, yawning. He was 19, barely old enough to shave, taken prisoner in the Hurtgen forest where the mud had swallowed entire companies whole. Another day of nothing, Dieter muttered in German, counting fence posts and waiting for letters that never come. Klaus smiled faintly. Better than counting shells. The camp had been their home since September. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences and watchtowers. The guards were relaxed, almost indifferent. There were no beatings, no starvation cells, no dogs tearing at flesh. It confused them at first. Where was the cruelty they'd been promised? Where was the American brutality their officers had sworn awaited captured soldiers? Instead, they'd found routine, work details in the nearby lumber mill, baseball games on Sunday afternoons that they watched through the fence, bewildered by the rules. And food. God, the food. It arrived in waves, 3 times a day, carried on metal trays by American cooks, who smiled as though feeding prisoners were no different than feeding friends. Outside, the November wind carried a new scent, something rich and savoury, laced with herbs and butter. It drifted through the cracks in the barrack walls, wrapping around the men like an invisible hand. Klaus sniffed the air, frowning. Smells different today. Dieter shrugged. Maybe they're burning garbage. But it wasn't garbage. As the prisoners filed toward the mess hall for breakfast, the smell grew stronger, more insistent. It mingled with wood smoke and something sweet, like caramelized sugar. The Americans stood outside the kitchen, laughing among themselves, their breath visible in the cold. One of them, a corporal with red cheeks and an easy grin, caught Klaus's eye and nodded. "Big day, fellas," the corporal said in English. "Thanksgiving." Klaus understood the word, but not its meaning. He'd heard it before, whispered among the guards, but it carried no weight in his vocabulary. Just another American custom, strange and unknowable. Inside the mess hall, the prisoners gathered at long wooden tables, their voices a low rumble of German, mixed with the clatter of tin cups. The Americans served breakfast as usual, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. But today, there was something else, a tension in the air, a sense of ceremony that hadn't existed before. Sergeant Miller, the head cook, stood at the front of the hall, hands on his hips, surveying the room like a general before a campaign. He was a broad man from Kentucky, his apron stained with grease and flour. When he spoke, his voice boomed across the room, translated haltingly by the camp interpreter, a German-American private named Weber. "Gentlemen," Miller began, and Weber echoed in German, "Today is Thanksgiving, a day we Americans set aside to give thanks for what we have, and because you're under our care, you'll share in it too." The prisoners exchanged glances. Klaus leaned toward Dieter. "What is he talking about?" Weber continued translating. "Tonight, you'll eat the same meal we do. Turkey, stuffing, potatoes, gravy, pie, everything." A ripple of laughter spread through the hall, not joyful laughter, but the bitter kind born of disbelief. Turkey? Here? In a prison camp? It sounded absurd. Another American exaggeration, like their claims of endless oil and steel. "They think we're fools," someone muttered from the back. Probably horse meat with feathers stuck in it. Klaus said nothing. He watched Miller's face, searching for mockery, but found only sincerity. The sergeant believed what he was saying. That much was clear. Whether it was true, that remained to be seen. The morning passed slowly. Work details were lighter than usual, as if even labor took a holiday. Klaus was assigned to sweep the supply shed, a task that required more standing than sweeping. Through the open door, he watched the American cooks hauling crates from a refrigerated truck, steam rising from the ice-packed interior. One crate was enormous, requiring 2 men to carry. When they tilted it, Klaus saw pale, plucked skin stretched over enormous bodies. Birds. Huge birds. Dieter appeared beside him, broom in hand, eyes wide. Those can't be real. They're real, Klaus said quietly. I've seen turkeys before. My uncle raised them in Bavaria, but never this size. How do they afford this? Dieter whispered. We couldn't feed our own soldiers this well. Klaus didn't answer. The question hung between them, heavy and uncomfortable. The Reich had promised victory through sacrifice, through discipline and will. But here, in captivity, they were witnessing something that defied every lesson they'd been taught. The enemy didn't just have more weapons, they had more of everything. By afternoon, the entire camp buzzed with anticipation. Men who had mocked the idea now gathered near the mess hall, drawn by the smell that poured from the kitchen like a siren song. Fat and smoke, herbs and heat. It was the smell of abundance, of a world that had not been bombed into, rubble. Klaus stood near the fence, staring out at the Georgia pines. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the compound. He thought of his wife, Greta, back in Hamburg. Was she even alive? The last letter he'd received, months ago, had mentioned bombings, rationing, children scavenging for coal. He wondered what she would think if she knew he was about to eat turkey while she starved. The guilt pressed against his ribs like a fist. He wanted to refuse the meal, to stand in defiance, to prove he hadn't forgotten his country. But his stomach growled, loud and shameless. The body, he realized, had no loyalty. As evening fell, the prisoners lined up outside the mess hall. The guards, relaxed as always, motioned them forward. No rifles pointed, no shouting, just the quiet shuffle of boots on gravel. Inside, the hall had been transformed. Long tables draped with white sheets, tin plates polished to a dull shine, and at the center of each table, enormous platters piled high with food. Klaus froze in the doorway. The sight stunned him into silence. Golden-brown turkeys, their skin crackling and glistening with fat, mounds of mashed potatoes, smooth as snow, bowls of stuffing, dark with herbs and onions, gravy boats steaming gently, cranberry sauce, bright red, quivering like jelly, and at the far end, pies, apple, pumpkin, their crusts flaking and perfect. Dieter stood beside him, mouth slightly open. "This is a dream," he whispered. "Or a trick," Klaus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The prisoners filled the benches slowly, unsure how to proceed. Across the hall, American soldiers sat at their own tables, eating the same meal. No separation, no hierarchy, just 2 groups of men, enemies by circumstance, united by hunger. Sergeant Miller stood and raised his glass of water. "Gentlemen," he said, and Weber translated, "we eat together tonight, not as victors and defeated, but as men grateful to be alive. Dig in." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, hands reached for serving spoons. Plates filled. The hall erupted into the sound of chewing, of forks scraping metal, of men rediscovering what it meant to eat without fear. Klaus carved a slice of turkey, the meat falling apart under his knife. He brought it to his mouth, hesitant, as if the act itself were a betrayal. The taste hit him like a wave. Rich, tender, soaked in butter and salt. His throat tightened, not from the food, but from memory. His mother's kitchen, Sunday dinners before the war, the smell of roasting meat and his father's laughter. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the barbed wire disappeared. He was home. He was whole. Across the table, Dieter ate with both hands, stuffing forkfuls of potatoes into his mouth, tears streaming down his face. "It's real," he kept saying. "It's real." Others ate in silence, their faces unreadable. Some wept openly. Others stared at their plates as if the food might vanish. One man, a former Wehrmacht officer, set down his fork and buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. Klaus understood. This wasn't just a meal, it was proof. Proof that their leaders had lied. Proof that the enemy they'd been taught to despise possessed a generosity the Reich had never shown its own people. Proof that mercy existed, even in war. The laughter started slowly. First one man, then another, then entire tables erupting into the kind of laughter that comes after long crying. Not joy, exactly, but relief, the kind of release that only happens when a terrible weight is finally lifted. Sergeant Miller walked between the tables, refilling water glasses, nodding to the men. When he reached Klaus, he paused. He asked in broken German. Klaus looked up, his eyes red. "Ja," he said quietly. "Sehr gut." Miller smiled and moved on. Klaus watched him go, this man who owed him nothing, who had every reason to hate him, yet had chosen instead to feed him. The contradictions piled up in his mind, too heavy to carry. As the meal wound down, the prisoners leaned back in their chairs, hands on their bellies, faces flushed. The hall smelled of contentment, of grease and gratitude. Somewhere in the corner, an American soldier played a harmonica, a slow, mournful tune that drifted through the room like smoke. Klaus thought of Greta again. He thought of the men he'd fought beside, the ones who hadn't made it to captivity. He thought of the lies he'd believed, the propaganda that had promised American savagery. And he thought of this meal, this impossible, generous act that defied everything he'd been taught. Dieter leaned toward him, his voice low. "When we go home, who will believe this?" Klaus shook his head. "No one." He paused, then added, "Maybe that's why it matters." That night, as the prisoners returned to their barracks, the November cold felt less bitter. The stars hung bright and clear overhead. Klaus lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his stomach full for the first time in months. Sleep came easily, but before it did, he whispered a prayer, not to God, exactly, but to whoever might be listening, a prayer of thanks for the meal, for the mercy, for the strange, impossible kindness of enemies who had chosen to share their table. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and roasted meat. The war raged on across oceans and continents, but here, in this corner of Georgia, on this cold November night, something quieter had taken place. Something that would outlast the battles and the bombs, a lesson written not in orders or doctrine, but in butter and gravy. That even in humanity's darkest hours, a shared meal could remind men of what they'd forgotten, that they were not just soldiers or prisoners, but human beings capable of grace. And for Klaus Richter, lying in his bunk beneath a foreign sky, that lesson tasted sweeter than any victory. The morning after Thanksgiving broke cold and grey, the Georgia sun struggling to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Klaus woke slowly, his body heavy with the kind of sleep that comes after long hunger finally satisfied. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then, the rough wool of the prison blanket scratched his cheek, and reality settled back over him like frost. Around him, the barracks stirred with the sounds of men waking, coughs, groans, the creak of bunks bearing weight. Dieter sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his eyes, his face still puffy from sleep and yesterday's feast. "I dreamed of home," he said quietly. "But when I woke up, I was still full." Klaus swung his legs over the side of his bunk, feeling the ache in his joints, the tightness in his belly. He wasn't used to abundance anymore. His body had forgotten how to hold so much. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "To feel guilty for eating." Across the barracks, other voices murmured in German. Some men spoke of the meal with wonder, others with shame. One older prisoner, a veteran of the First War, sat alone by the window, staring out at nothing. When Klaus caught his eye, The man looked away quickly, as if caught in some private betrayal. The bell rang for morning formation, and the prisoners filed outside into the cold. The compound looked the same as always. Guard towers, barbed wire, the American flag hanging limp in the still air. But something had shifted, something invisible but undeniable. Sergeant Miller stood near the mess hall, smoking a cigarette, his breath mixing with the smoke. When the prisoners passed, he nodded, his expression unchanged. No gloating, no superiority, just a man who'd cooked a meal and moved on. Klaus found himself watching the Americans more closely now, the way they laughed easily among themselves, the casual manner in which they carried their rifles, as if the weapons were tools rather than extensions of power. The way they shared cigarettes with each other, passing them back and forth without ceremony. It was the opposite of everything he'd known in the Place, Wehrmacht. There, hierarchy had been absolute. Officers ate separately, orders were barked, never discussed. Weakness was punished, kindness suspected. But here, the Americans seemed to operate on different principles. Principles he didn't fully understand but could no longer ignore. Breakfast that morning was simple: oatmeal, toast, coffee, a return to routine after yesterday's extravagance. Klaus ate slowly, savouring the warmth, the sweetness of the brown sugar sprinkled on top. Across from him, Dieter pushed his spoon around his bowl, lost in thought. "What are you thinking?" Klaus asked. Dieter looked up, his young face troubled. "I'm thinking that if they can feed us like kings, what else were we told that wasn't true?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and inevitable. Klaus had been avoiding it since the moment he'd tasted that turkey. But now, spoken aloud, it demanded an answer. "I don't know," he said finally, "but we can't unknow what we've seen." The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Work details resumed. Letters arrived sporadically from home, their contents growing darker. Hamburg bombed again, Berlin under siege, the Eastern Front collapsing. Each piece of news felt like another nail in a coffin the prisoners had been trying not to see. But inside the camp, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. The Americans organized a volleyball tournament. They set up a small library with German books acquired from somewhere. They allowed the prisoners to form a small orchestra that played on Sunday evenings, the music drifting across the compound like a ghost of the world before. Klaus found himself drawn to these moments, not because he'd forgotten he was a prisoner, but because they reminded him he was still human, that the war hadn't completely hollowed him out. One afternoon, while working in the camp workshop repairing furniture, he found himself beside Sergeant Miller. The American was fixing a broken chair leg, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up working with wood. "You have family?" Miller asked in his broken German. Klaus nodded. "Wife, 2 daughters. In Hamburg." Miller pulled a photograph from his wallet, a woman with dark hair and a wide smile, 2 boys in overalls standing in front of a farmhouse. He said simply, "Kentucky." They worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammers and saws filling the space between words. Finally, Klaus asked the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why do you feed us so well? We are your enemy." Miller set down his hammer, considering. His German wasn't good enough for a complex answer, so he spoke slowly, searching for simple words. "My father," he said, "First war, prisoner in Germany, said German soldiers gave him bread, shared their food." He paused, then added, "He said, they were just men like me." Klaus felt something crack open in his chest, a small fissure in the armor he'd been wearing since 1939. That evening, as the sun set behind the pines, Klaus sat outside the barracks, watching the light fade. Dieter joined him, along with a few other men. They didn't speak much, just sat in the cold, their breath visible in the darkening air. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Dieter asked. "Eventually," Klaus said, "but home might not be there anymore." "What will we tell them?" another prisoner asked. "About this place? About how we were treated?" Klaus thought for a long time before answering. "The truth," he said, even if they don't believe us. The truth was complicated. The truth was that they'd been captured by men they'd been taught to hate, and those men had shown them more humanity than their own leaders ever had. The truth was that a single meal had done more to break their faith in the Reich than all the propaganda and punishment ever could. Winter deepened, snow fell, covering the compound in white. Christmas approached, and the Americans decorated the mess, the hall with pine branches and paper stars. On Christmas Eve they served roast pork and potatoes, and a chaplain said a prayer in both English and German. Some prisoners wept. Others sang carols from childhood, their voices cracking with emotion. Klaus received a letter that week. It had taken 4 months to arrive, the envelope battered and stained. Inside, Greta's handwriting was shaky but familiar. The girls were safe, living with relatives in the countryside. Hamburg was a ruin. Food was scarce. She prayed for his safety and hoped he was not suffering. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, next to the photograph he kept of his daughters. He thought of them going to bed hungry while he had eaten turkey and stuffing. The guilt returned, sharp and insistent. But alongside the guilt was something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, exactly, but a kind of understanding. That kindness existed even in war. That mercy wasn't weakness. That the men who'd fed him had made a choice, and that choice mattered. One night in January, as 1945 began with news of Germany's continued collapse, Klaus lay in his bunk, unable to sleep. Around him, men snored and muttered in their dreams. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. He thought about Thanksgiving, about that moment when he'd first tasted the turkey and felt his entire worldview begin to crumble. He thought about Sergeant Miller and his story of his father. He thought about the American soldier who'd once shared a cigarette with him, saying nothing, just acknowledging their shared humanity with a simple gesture. The war would end. That much was certain now. Germany would fall. He would eventually return to whatever remained of his home. But he would carry this time with him. These memories of captivity that felt less like punishment and more like a lesson he hadn't known he needed. Dieter's voice drifted up from the bunk below. "Klaus? Are you awake?" "Yes. Do you ever think that maybe we were on the wrong side?" The question should have angered him, should have felt like treason. Instead, Klaus felt only a deep, bone-tired sadness. "Every day," he whispered. "Every day since Thanksgiving." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 men acknowledging a truth too large to hold alone. Outside, the wind rattled the barracks walls. Inside, warmth from the stove pushed back against the cold. Somewhere across the compound, a harmonica played, the same American soldier, playing the same mournful tune. Klaus closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. Tomorrow would bring more work, more letters, more news of defeat. But tonight, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, not for victory, not for the Reich, but for something simpler and more profound. Hope that when the war finally ended, men like Sergeant Miller would be the ones to build the peace. Men who understood that the enemy was also human. Men who chose to feed rather than starve, to show mercy rather than cruelty. Men who knew that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb, but a plate of food shared without condition. Klaus pulled his blanket tighter and finally drifted into sleep, dreaming not of battles or victories, but of his daughters running through a field where nothing burned, nothing fell from the sky, and everyone had enough to eat. February brought rain that turned the compound into a sea of mud. The prisoners slogged through it, their boots caked and heavy. But inside the mess hall, warmth waited. The meals continued, steady and abundant. Not as extravagant as Thanksgiving, but more than adequate, more than fair. Klaus had stopped questioning it. He ate what was given, worked when told, and spent his evenings writing letters home that might never arrive. The war news grew worse by the day. The Americans and British pushing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. Germany caught between two unstoppable forces, being crushed like grain between millstones. In the barracks at night, arguments sometimes broke out. A few prisoners, the true believers, still clung to hope that some miracle weapon would save the fatherland. Others had accepted reality and spoke openly of defeat. Klaus stayed quiet during these debates. He had made his peace with what was coming. One morning in March, Sergeant Miller approached him during work detail. "Come with me," he said simply. Klaus followed, wondering if he'd done something wrong. If anything, he looked almost sad. They walked to the camp office, where a Red Cross worker sat with a stack of papers. The woman looked up as they entered, her face professionally neutral. "Sit down, Mr. Richter," she said in German. Klaus sat, his heart beginning to pound. Nothing good ever came from being called to the office. Miller stood by the door, arms crossed, watching. The Red Cross worker opened a folder. "We've received information about your family," she began. Klaus gripped the arms of the chair. "Hamburg was bombed heavily in January. The records show that your wife and daughters were evacuated to Lübeck beforehand. They're alive. They're safe." The room seemed to tilt. Klaus closed his eyes, feeling tears push against his eyelids. "As certain as we can be in wartime, the Red Cross has confirmed their location and status. I can help you write to them, to let them know you're alive as well." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw Miller smiling faintly. "Good news," the sergeant said. "You write letter. We make sure it gets there." Later, sitting in the barracks with pen and paper, Klaus stared at the blank page for a long time. What could he tell Greta? How could he explain what he'd experienced here? How could he put into words the strange mercy of his captivity? In the end, he kept it simple. "I am well. I am fed. I am treated fairly. The Americans are not what we were told. When I come home, we will have much to discuss. Tell the girls I love them. Tell them their father is learning what peace might look like." He folded the letter carefully and gave it to Miller the next morning. The sergeant took it with a nod and promised it would go out with the next Red Cross shipment. Klaus believed him. He'd learned to trust this man's word. As March turned to April, rumors spread through the camp. The war was ending. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Each day brought new whispers, new stories. The guards seemed different too, more relaxed, talking among themselves about going home soon. On a warm afternoon in late April, the camp commander, a colonel named Harrison, assembled all the prisoners in the yard. He stood on a wooden platform, his uniform neat despite the heat. An interpreter stood beside him. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, and the German translation echoed across the assembled men. "As of yesterday, German forces in Italy have surrendered. Other units are following. The war in Europe will be over within days. You will remain here until arrangements can be made for your repatriation. But know this." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You are no longer enemy combatants. You are men waiting to go home. We will continue to treat you as such." The prisoners stood in silence, absorbing the news. Some faces showed relief, others despair. A few men wept openly. Klaus felt nothing at first, just a strange numbness. Then, slowly, something like grief washed over him, not for the Reich's defeat, that had been inevitable, but for all the years lost, all the lies believed, all the suffering that could have been avoided. That night, the mess hall was quiet despite the momentous news. Men ate in contemplative silence, each wrestling with their own thoughts about what came next. Klaus sat with Dieter and a few others, pushing food around his plate. "What will you do?" Dieter asked. "When you go back?" Klaus shrugged. "Find my family. Rebuild. Try to forget." "Can we forget?" another prisoner asked. "After everything?" "No," Klaus said quietly. "But maybe we can learn." Sergeant Miller stopped by their table, coffee pot in hand. He refilled their cups without being asked, a gesture that had become routine over the months. When he reached Klaus, he paused. War over soon, Miller said in his broken German. You go home, you tell them. He gestured around the mess hall. You tell them about this. Klaus looked up at him. What should I tell them? Miller thought for a moment, then smiled. Tell them American know how to cook turkey. He laughed at his own joke, then grew serious. Tell them we all just men. Tell them peace is better with full stomach. After he'd moved on, Dieter shook his head in wonder. He's right, you know. Who would believe that our captivity was better than our service? Klaus stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise and dissipate. Maybe that's the point, he said. Maybe that's what they wanted us to learn. The days that followed blurred together. Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945. The news was met with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow in the camp. It was over. Finally, terribly, completely over. The Americans organized a small ceremony. They raised their flag and played their anthem. They didn't force the German prisoners to attend, but many did, standing at a respectful distance, bearing witness to the end of their nation's ambitions. Klaus stood among them, feeling the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. He thought of his father, who'd fought in the First War and returned broken. He thought of his daughters, who would grow up in a Germany he couldn't yet imagine. And he thought of Thanksgiving, of that moment when everything he'd believed had begun to unravel with the taste of butter and herbs. Processing for repatriation began in June. The prisoners were interviewed, documented, given clean clothes and medical examinations. Klaus was deemed healthy enough to travel, his paperwork cleared, his return date set for July. On his last morning at Camp Gordon, he woke early and walked the perimeter of the compound. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds sang in the pines. The air smelled of dew and distant coffee. Sergeant Miller found him there, standing by the fence, looking out at the free world beyond. Today is your day, the sergeant said. Yes, Klaus replied. Today I go home. You remember? What I say about telling people? Klaus nodded. I will remember everything. Miller extended his hand. Klaus hesitated, then took it. The handshake was firm, honest, the grip of equals. Good luck, Miller said. Make good peace. You too, Klaus replied. Later, as the trucks rolled out of Camp Gordon carrying the first group of repatriated prisoners, Klaus looked back through the canvas flap. He saw the barracks where he'd slept, the mess hall where he'd been fed, the guard towers where men had watched over him with bored indifference rather than cruelty. He thought about what he would tell Greta when he finally saw her again. How could he explain that his captivity had taught him more about humanity than his entire service in the Wehrmacht? How could he make her understand that the enemy had shown him mercy when his own leaders had shown only contempt? Beside him, Dieter stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. What will we find when we get back? He asked. I don't know, Klaus said honestly. But whatever it is, we'll face it with full stomachs and clear minds. The truck rumbled through the Georgia countryside, past farms and churches, past American families waving from their porches. Klaus waved back, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago. But much had become thinkable in the months since Thanksgiving. As the miles rolled past, Klaus closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine the future. His daughters grown tall, his home rebuilt. Germany at peace, finally, truly at peace. It seemed impossible, but then again, so had the kindness of his captors, so had the turkey and stuffing served without malice, so had the simple humanity of men who could have been cruel but chose otherwise. The narrator's voice would settle here, quiet and reflective, as the image faded to the Georgia countryside rolling past. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with weapons, but with generosity. Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought on fields of war, but in the hearts of men learning to see their enemies as human. On that Thanksgiving Day in 1944, America didn't just feed its prisoners. It planted seeds of a different future, one where mercy mattered more than might, where a shared meal could begin to heal what years of propaganda had broken. Klaus Richter would return to Hamburg in August of 1945. He would find his family living in the rubble of their former neighborhood. He would spend years rebuilding, not just his home, but his understanding of the world. And when his daughters asked about his time as a prisoner, he would tell them the truth. That he had been captured by the enemy and treated better than he'd been treated by his own army, that he had eaten turkey while Germany starved, that he had learned peace was possible because men like Sergeant Miller had chosen to teach it, one meal at a time. Some stories from the war spoke of horror and hatred. This one spoke of something quieter but no less powerful, the simple truth that even in humanity's darkest hours, kindness could survive. And sometimes that kindness came with gravy. Years later, in 1953, Klaus Richter stood in his rebuilt home in Hamburg, watching his daughters set the table for dinner. The older one, now 15, carefully arranged the plates while her younger sister folded napkins with the concentration of a surgeon. Greta moved between the kitchen and dining room, carrying steaming dishes, her hair now streaked with grey. It was a modest meal by American standards: roasted chicken, potatoes, cabbage. But it was more than they'd had during the lean years right after the war, when Hamburg had been nothing but ash and hunger. Klaus had worked construction for 7 years, rebuilding the city brick by brick, his hands growing calloused and strong. "Papa," his younger daughter called, "come eat before it gets cold." He sat at the head of the table, a position that still felt strange after years of barrack life and shared benches. Greta served him first, as she always did, and he waited until everyone had food before picking up his fork, an old habit from Camp Gordon that he'd never quite shaken. "You're doing it again," Greta said softly, smiling. "That American thing." Klaus looked down at his plate, realizing he'd been waiting for everyone to be served. In the Wehrmacht, officers ate first. In the camp, everyone ate together. He'd chosen to keep the American way. "Old habits," he said, but they both knew it was more than that. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the girls had gone to their rooms to study, Klaus and Greta sat by the window overlooking the street. The neighborhood was coming back to life, new buildings rising where ruins had stood, shops reopening, children playing in streets that had once been silent with death. Dieter came by the construction site today, Klaus said, asked if I wanted to join him for drinks tomorrow. "The boy from the camp?" Greta asked. She'd heard the stories many times, the young prisoner who'd cried over American food, who'd questioned everything they'd been taught. "He's not a boy anymore," Klaus said. "He's 28 now, works as a teacher, says he wants to make sure the next generation learns the truth." Greta was quiet for a moment, then asked the question she'd asked many times before. "Do you regret it, being captured instead of dying for them?" Klaus looked at her, at the lines around her eyes that had deepened during his absence, at the strength in her face that had kept their family alive through the bombings and the starvation. "Every day I thank God I was captured," he said, "because if I hadn't been, I might never have understood what we'd become." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed Sergeant Miller standing in front of the Camp Gordon mess hall, his apron stained, his smile easy. An American soldier had taken the picture and given it to Klaus as a parting gift. On the back, Miller had written in careful German, "Remember, we are all just men." "I still think about that Thanksgiving," Klaus said. "How we mocked them, how we called their food garbage, how sure we were of our superiority." He shook his head. "And then we tasted it, and everything changed." "It wasn't the food that changed you," Greta said gently. "It was the kindness." "Maybe," Klaus admitted, "but the food made it real. You can ignore words, you can dismiss gestures, but when someone feeds you better than your own side ever did, when they share their holiday with prisoners, when they treat you like a human being worth keeping alive." He trailed off. "That's harder to forget." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and clean, covering the scars of the city in white. Klaus watched it drift past the window, thinking of Georgia snow, of pine trees and barbed wire, of the strange peace he'd found in captivity. "Miller sent another letter," he said. "Arrived last week. He and his family are doing well. His boys are in university now. He asked about the girls, about our life here. You'll write back? Of course. Klaus smiled. He's my friend. Strange to say, isn't it? My captor became my friend. Greta said. Not anymore. The truth was that the world had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined during the war. Germany had been split, rebuilt, reimagined. The Americans who had bombed them had stayed to feed them, to help them reconstruct, to teach them a different way. The Marshall Plan had poured money into the ruins, turning enemies into allies with the same logic that had guided Camp Gordon's kitchen. Feed them, and they'll remember. Show mercy, and they'll learn peace. Klaus had watched it happen in real time. The Berlin airlift, when the Americans had flown food into the blockaded city, the care packages arriving from across the Atlantic, the slow, steady transformation of occupation into partnership. It was Thanksgiving dinner on a national scale, and it was working. Do you think the girls understand? Greta asked. What you try to teach them about the war? Klaus considered. I think they understand that their father was wrong about many things, that the men we were told to hate turned out to be the ones who saved us. He paused. I hope they remember that. I hope they teach their children that peace is built with full stomachs and open hands, not with empty promises and clenched fists. Later that night, unable to sleep, Klaus went to his desk and pulled out the journal he'd kept since returning home. Its pages were filled with memories of the camp, of conversations with Dieter and the others, of small moments that had shattered their certainty. He turned to a page, dated November 1944, and read his own words, written shortly after his capture. Today the Americans fed us turkey for their Thanksgiving holiday. We laughed at them, called it prison food, said it couldn't be real. But it was real, more real than anything the Reich ever gave us. I ate until my stomach hurt, and then I went back to my bunk and cried, not from sadness, but from understanding. We had been lied to about everything. The Americans were supposed to be weak, degenerate, incapable of sacrifice or discipline. Instead, they are strong enough to show mercy, rich enough to share, secure enough to treat their enemies with dignity. I don't know what this means for Germany. I don't know what this means for me. But I know I will never forget the taste of that meal, or the man who cooked it, or the lesson it taught me about what strength really means. Klaus closed the journal and returned it to the drawer. Outside his window, Hamburg slept beneath its blanket of snow. Somewhere across the ocean, in Kentucky, Sergeant Miller was probably asleep too, dreaming his own dreams of peace and plenty. Two men who had been enemies, two nations that had tried to destroy each other, and between them, the memory of a meal that had proven stronger than propaganda, more powerful than hate. The narrator's voice would return here, gentle and conclusive, as the image faded to Klaus's window overlooking the rebuilt city. History remembers the battles, the generals, the grand strategies of war. But sometimes the most important moments happen in mess halls and kitchens, where ordinary men make extraordinary choices. On Thanksgiving Day, 1944, Sergeant Miller didn't just cook a meal. He planted the seeds of reconciliation. He showed German prisoners what their own leaders never could, that generosity wasn't weakness, that mercy wasn't defeat, that humanity survived even in the heart of war. Klaus Richter would live until 1987, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75. His daughters would find, among his papers, dozens of letters exchanged with Miller over 4 decades, recipes shared, stories told, memories preserved. Two families, once separated by war, connected by a single act of kindness that had rippled forward through time. In his will, Klaus left instructions for his epitaph. It read simply, "He learned peace from his enemies." And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not that Germany had been defeated, but that its people had been shown a better way, not through conquest or humiliation, but through the simple, profound act of breaking bread together. The turkey that Klaus tasted on that cold November day in Georgia wasn't just food, it was prophecy. It was the future, served on a tin plate, promising that even after the darkest night of war, morning could come. and with it, the possibility of forgiveness, understanding, and peace. Some lessons are taught in classrooms, others in trenches, but the ones that last, the ones that change hearts and nations, are often taught at tables, where enemies become neighbours, where hatred dissolves into hunger satisfied, where the world learns that the opposite of war isn't just the absence of fighting, it's the presence of grace. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.